Curly lived the shortest life of the Stooges, dying at the age of 48. He was given a Jewish funeral and laid to rest at the Western Jewish Institute section of Peace Cemetery in East Los Angeles. Curly's older brothers, Benjamin and Shemp, and parents, Jenny, Solomon, are all interred there as well. Here's a little bit about Curly's personal life. Believe it or not, Curly's off-screen personality was the opposite of his on-screen manic persona. He was an introvert. He generally kept to himself, rarely socializing with people unless he had been drinking, which he would increasingly turn to as the stresses of his career grew. In addition, he came to life when the presence of brother Shemp would be around, and Curly could not be himself around brother Mo, who treated his younger brother with a fatherly wag of the finger. That kind of fit Mo's personality. Curly was never an intellectual, didn't graduate high school. Curly simply refrained from engaging in crazy antics unless he was in his element, with family, performing, or intoxicated. Curly was insecure about his shaved head. He believed it made him unappealing to women. He increasingly drank to excess and caroused to cope with his feelings of inferiority. He took to wearing a hat in public to convey an image of masculinity, saying he felt like a little kid with his hair shaved off, even though he was popular with women all his life. In fact, many who knew him said women were his main weakness. Mo's son-in-law, Norman Maurer, even went so far as to say he was a pushover for women. If a pretty girl went up to him and gave him a spiel, Curly would marry them. Then she would take all his money and run off. It was the same when a real estate agent would come up and say, "I have a house for you." Curly would just sell his current home and buy another one. During World War II, for 7 months of each year, the Three Stooges filming career would go on hiatus, and that would allow them to make personal appearances for the troops. The Stooges entertained servicemen constantly, and the intense work schedule took its toll on Curly. He never drank while performing on stage. Mo would not allow it. But once away from Mo's watchful eye, he would find the nearest nightclub, down a few drinks, and enjoy himself. His drinking, eating, and carousing increased. He had difficulties managing his finances, often spending his money on wine, food, women, homes, cars, especially dogs, and was often near poverty. Mo eventually helped him manage his money and even filled out his income tax returns. Curly found constant companionship in his dogs and often befriended strays whenever the Stooges were traveling. There was an episode where there were a lot of dogs involved, and I remember Curly looked very comfortable around them. He would pick up homeless dogs and take them with him from town to town until he found them a home somewhere else on the tour. When not performing, he would usually have a few dogs waiting for him at his home. Mo urged Curly to find himself a wife, hoping it would persuade his brother to finally settle down and allow his health to improve somewhat. After a 2-week courtship, he married a woman by the name of Marion Buxbaum, October 17, 1945, and that marriage lasted approximately 3 months. The divorce proceeding was a bitter one. Of course, it was exploited by the local media. After the divorce, his health fell into rapid and devastating decline. Curly's legacy: he is considered by many fans and critics alike to be their favorite member of the Three Stooges. In a 1972 interview, Larry Fine recalled, "Personally, I thought Curly was the greatest because he was a natural comedian who had no formal training. Whatever he did, he made up on the spur of the moment. When we lost Curly, we took a hit. Curly's mannerisms, behavior, and personality, along with his catchphrases of yuck, 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 woo, 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 and certainly have become a part of American popular culture. Steve Allen, a famous comedian and talk show host, called him one of the most original yet seldom recognized comic geniuses. I could not agree with him more. Few comics have come close to equaling the pure energy and genuine sense of fun Curly was able to project. He was merriment personified, a creature of frantic action whose only concern was to satisfy his immediate cravings, allowing his emotions to dominate and making no attempt whatsoever to hide his true feelings. He would chuckle self-indulgently at his own cleverness. When confronted with the problem, he would grunt, slap his face, and tackle the obstacle with all the tenacity of a 6-year-old child. On several occasions, Moe was convinced that rising star Lou Costello, who was a close friend of Shemp, was stealing material from Curly. Costello was known to acquire prints of the Stooges films from Columbia Pictures on occasion, presumably to study Curly. Inevitably, Curly's routines would show up in Abbott and Costello feature films, much to Moe's chagrin. Another unfortunate thing was that the Columbia Pictures president, Harry Cohn, would not allow the Stooges to make feature-length films like their contemporaries Laurel and Hardy, the Marx Brothers, and Abbott and Costello. I could only imagine how phenomenal a full-length Stooges film would have been made in the era when the Three Stooges were at their best with Moe, Larry, and Curly. I could hear Curly's remark to that particular situation with one of his famous phrases, "I'm a victim of circumstance." Yep, he had all the phrases, and we have all the memories. And thank you to Three Stooges, especially to my favorite, Curly Howard. Curly Howard was born Jerome Lester Harwitz, October 22nd, 1903, and he passed away January 18, 1952. And as most people know, he is better known by his stage name, Curly Howard. He was, of course, an American comedian and a vaudevillian actor. He was best known as a member of what is called the American farce comedy team, the Three Stooges, of course. Also featured his older brothers Moe and Shemp Howard, and Larry Fine. Curly was generally considered the most popular and recognizable of the Three Stooges. He was well known for his high-pitched voice and vocal expressions such as yuck, 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 woo, 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 and certainly, and barking like a dog, as well as his physical comedy, falling on the ground, pivoting on his shoulder, spinning. Actually, he could have been considered the first break dancer. He would walk in circular motions, do improvisations, all kinds of interesting and funny slapstick type comedy. He actually was an untrained actor. Curly was born in Brooklyn, the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, that is a borough of New York City, was of Lithuanian Jewish ancestry. He was the youngest of 5 sons, and because he was the youngest, his brothers called him Babe to tease him. That name stuck with him throughout his entire life. Although when his brother Shemp Howard married, he was also nicknamed Babe. The brothers called him Curly to avoid the confusion, and that is how Curly got the nickname Curly. Curly was a quiet child, rarely caused any problems for his parents, unlike his older brothers Mo and Shemp. They were said to excel in causing problems for the parents. He was a mediocre student, but did well as an athlete on the school basketball team. He never graduated from high school. He kept himself busy with odd jobs and constantly following his older brothers whom he idolized. He was also, believe it or not, an accomplished ballroom dancer and singer. And he regularly turned up at what was known as the Triangle Ballroom in Brooklyn, occasionally bumping into George Raft, the famous actor who was known to play gangsters and that sort of thing. When Curly was 12, he accidentally shot himself in the left ankle while cleaning a rifle. Mo rushed him to the hospital and saved his life. The wound resulted in a noticeably thinner left leg and a slight limp. I wonder if that had anything to do with some of his gyrations and motions when he was doing his comedy. He was so frightened of surgery that he never had the limp corrected. Can't blame him. While with the Stooges, he developed his famous exaggerated walk to mask the limp on the screen. Curly was interested in music and comedy and would watch his brothers Shemp and Mo perform as Stooges in Ted Healy's vaudeville act. Ted Healy was actually the founder and formed the very original Three Stooges. Ted Healy used to play along with the Three Stooges. He was kind of like the fourth Stooge or the straight man. He also liked to hang around backstage, although he never participated in any of the routines. So that answers the question about Curly being in any of these Ted Healy routines. Curly married his first wife, Julia Rosenthal, on August 5th, 1930, but the couple had their marriage annulled shortly afterwards. Curly's first onstage break was a comedy musical conductor in 1928 for the Orville Knapp Band. Mo later recalled that his performances usually overshadowed those of the band. Though Curly enjoyed the gig, the work, he watched his older brothers Mo and Shemp and partner Larry Fine made it big as some of Ted Healy's Stooges. Vaudeville star Healy had a popular stage act in which he would try to tell jokes or sing, only to have the Stooges wander on the stage and interrupt or heckle him and cause disturbances from the audience. Meanwhile, Healy and company appeared in their first feature film, Rube Goldberg's Soup to Nuts, in 1930. Shemp, however, disliked Healy. He disliked Healy's bad temper, heavy drinking. So, in 1932, he was offered a contract with a movie studio in Brooklyn, and he took that contract. And when that happened, that is when Curly became part of the Three Stooges act. So with Shemp gone, Mo suggested Curly fill in the role of the third Stooge, but Healy felt that Curly, with his thick chestnut hair, believe it or not, he had very thick hair, and his mustache did not look funny. He was too handsome. Curly left the room, returned minutes later with his head shaven. The mustache remained briefly. Healy quipped, "Boy, don't you look girly." Mo misheard the joke as Curly and who witnessed the exchange realized that the nickname Curly would be a perfect fit. That's how he got his name, Curly. In one of the interviews Curly gave in his lifetime, he complained about the loss of his hair. "I had to shave it off right down to the skin," is what he said. In 1934, MGM was building Healy up as a solo comedian in some feature films, so he dissolved the Three Stooges act to pursue his own career, just like Shemp. The team of Howard Fine and Howard was tired of Healy's alcoholism and abrasiveness and renamed their act the Three Stooges. That same year, they signed on to appear in 2 real comedy short subjects for Columbia Pictures. The Stooges soon became the most popular short subject attraction, with Curly playing an integral part in the Three Stooges' work. Thank goodness for Ted Healy's drinking and bad behavior, because if that wasn't so, maybe the Three Stooges would never have formed, and millions of people are glad they did. They have brought so much entertainment and laughter over the many, many years. One of Curly's attributes in being one of the Three Stooges, he developed a reputation. He was known in the act for having an indestructible head, which always won out by breaking anything that assaulted it, including saws. Curly, when he would break a saw, or a saw would break trying to cut his head, he would then quip, "Oh, look, look." So Curly had no formal acting training, but his comedic skills were fantastic. They were exceptional. Most often, directors would simply let the camera roll freely and let Curly improvise. Jules White, in particular, would leave gaps in the Stooge scripts where Curly could improvise for several minutes. In later years, White commented, "If we wrote a scene and needed a little something extra, I'd say to Curly, 'Look, we've got a gap to fill. Fill it in with this woo 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 or some other bit of business,' and he never disappointed us." By the time the Stooges hit their peak in the late 30s, their films had almost become vehicles for Curly's unbridled comic performances. "A Plumbing We Will Go," "We Want Our Mummy," "An Ache in Every Steak," "Cactus Makes Perfect." These shorts display his ability to take inanimate objects like food, tools, pipes, etc., and then turn them into ingenious comic props. Who could forget that battle that Curly had while eating a bowl of soup? I believe it was clam chowder, and he's fighting this clam in this bowl of soup. He took out a spool of thread and he goes fishing for this clam in the bowl of soup. And then, of course, he got frustrated and lost his temper and starts smacking into the bowl of soup. Just one of the many hilarious routines that Curly has done throughout the years. Moe later confirmed that when Curly forgot his lines, that merely allowed him to improvise on the spot. It was said, quote, "If we were going through a scene and he forgot his words for a moment, rather than stand, get pale and stop, you never knew what he was going to do. On one occasion, he'd get down to the floor and spin around like a top until he remembered what to say." How about that? Curly also developed some other reactions, expressions that we have all learned to love, tried to imitate, and here are a few of them. I'll try to do them. Please excuse me, they're not anywhere nearly as good as Curly, but he would say, "Yuck, yuck, 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 yuck," and that was his traditional laughter, accompanied by his fingers snapping, his fingers hitting the bottom of his chin, or woo 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 when he was scared, or that was kind of an underbreath sound that he would make, or la da dee 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 dee. If he was busy working, that was a song that he would sing. Or, of course, this famous expression or word, certainly, or a miter you. And there are just so many. I'm not going to bore you with any more of them. The best way to listen to these sort of things is to actually listen to Curly do them himself. By 1944, Curly's energy began to wane. You could see his energy was starting to wane. His ill health forced him to rest, leading to only 5 shorts being released in 1945. And I believe the normal output was 6 to 8 a year. And in 1945, Curly was diagnosed with extreme hypertension, retinal hemorrhage, and obesity. The episode Half-Wit's Holiday, released in 1947, would be Curly's final appearance as an official member of the Stooges. During filming in 1946, Curly suffered a severe stroke while sitting in director Jules' white chair, waiting to film the last scene of the day. When Curly was called by the assistant director to take the stage, he did not answer. Mo went looking for his brother. He found Curly with his head dropped to his chest. Mo later recalled that his mouth was distorted and he was unable to speak, only cry. Mo quietly alerted White, the director, to all of this, leading the latter to rework the scene quickly, dividing the action between Mo and Larry while Curly was rushed to the hospital. I guess that's what they mean, the show must go on. And Mo joined Curly after they finished their filming. Curly spent several weeks at the Motion Picture and Television Country House and Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, is where it was located. And then he returned home for further recuperation. In 1945, Shemp had been recruited to substitute for Curly, agreed to replace him in the Columbia Shorts, but only until his younger brother was well enough to rejoin the act. So in 1947, Columbia Pictures signed a contract by all 4 Stooges and stipulated that Shemp's joining in place and instead would only be temporary until Curly recovered. Curly partially recovered and with his hair regrown made a brief cameo appearance as a train passenger. I remember that vividly, barking in his sleep in the 3rd film after Brother Shemp's return, Hold That Line, in 1947. It was the only film that featured Larry Fine and all 3 Howard brothers, Mo, Shemp, Curly, simultaneously. Director White later said he spontaneously staged the bit during Curly's impromptu visit to the stage. Quote, "It was a spur-of-the-moment idea. Curly was visiting the set. This was sometime after his stroke. Apparently he came in on his own since I didn't see a nurse with him. He was sitting around reading a newspaper. As I walked in, the newspaper he had in front of his face came down and he waved hello to me. I thought it would be funny to have him do a bit in the picture, and he was happy to do it." Curly filmed the second cameo as an irate chef 2 years later for the short Malice in the Palace. But due to his illness, and that was in 1949. But due to his illness, his performance was not deemed good enough and his scenes were cut. Curly, still not fully recovered from his stroke, met another woman, Valerie Newman, and married July 31, 1947. Although his health continued to decline after the marriage, Valerie gave birth to a daughter, Janie, in 1948. Later that year, Curly suffered a second massive stroke, which left him partially paralyzed. He used a wheelchair by 1950. He went through some more treatment. In February 1951, he was placed in a nursing home where he suffered another stroke a month later, and eventually he went into the North Hollywood Hospital and Sanitarium. In December 1951, the North Hollywood Hospital and Sanitarium advised the Howard family that Curly was becoming a problem to the nursing staff at the facility because of his mental deterioration. They admitted they could no longer care for him and suggested he be placed in a mental hospital. Moe refused to do this, relocated him to another sanitarium, the Baldy View Sanitarium in San Gabriel, California. January 7th, 1952, Moe was contacted on the Columbia set while filming to help move Curly for what would be the last time. 11 days later, on January 18, Curly died. Curly lived the shortest life of the Stooges, dying at the age of 48. He was given a Jewish funeral and laid to rest at the Western Jewish Institute section of Peace Cemetery in East Los Angeles. Curly's older brothers, Benjamin and Shemp, and parents, Jenny, Solomon, are all interred there as well. And we have all the memories. And thank you to Three Stooges, especially to my favorite, Curly Howard. Rest in peace.